President Donald Trump imposed a 25% tariff on all exports from Canada and Mexico, with the exception of Canadian oil and gas, which was set for 10%, and this instantly became a nightmare for both countries. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum quickly held a phone conversation with Trump, ultimately agreeing to his terms in order to have the tariffs lifted. Following the discussion, Trump agreed to pause the tariff plan for at least 30 days. As part of the agreement, Mexico pledged to reinforce its northern border with troops, while in return, the U.S. promised to limit the flow of guns into Mexico. Meanwhile, Canada also agreed to strengthen its border with the U.S. to curb illegal migration and the trafficking of fentanyl. However, Trump's executive order was only paused for 30 days, meaning that if he was not satisfied with the results, he would enforce the tariffs. Many economists and analysts predicted that these tariffs would also hurt American consumers by increasing the cost of essential goods, while others believed that the economic consequences would be even more severe for Canada and Mexico. This raises an important question. Why are Canada and Mexico so concerned about Trump's tariff plan? And what motivated Trump to impose these tariffs in the first place? When it comes to Canada, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has emphasized that Americans need Canada just as much as Canada needs the U.S. However, some argue that Canada is far more dependent on the American market than the other way around. In 2022, Canada exported approximately $438 billion USD worth of goods to the United States. A significant portion of these exports came from crude petroleum, $117 billion US dollars, followed by cars, $27 billion US dollars, and petroleum gas, $22.4 billion US dollars. In comparison, US exports to Canada in 2017 were valued at $308 billion USD, including cars, $16.9 billion USD, refined petroleum, $15.7 billion USD, and delivery trucks, $14.2 billion USD. Furthermore, Canada imported approximately $471 billion US dollars worth of goods from the US in 2022, marking a 20% increase from the previous year. This surge was mainly driven by rising energy prices and greater demand for crude oil and refined petroleum. Based on these figures, the U.S. technically has a trade surplus with Canada in goods trade, meaning that Canada buys more from the U.S. than it sells to it. However, when factoring in trade and services, the numbers tell a different story. Canada's total exports to the U.S., including goods and services, amounted to approximately $590 billion US dollars, while total imports from the U.S. stood at $560 billion US dollars. This resulted in an overall trade surplus of around $30 billion US dollars in favor of Canada, which is something Trump is keenly aware of. Trump has long been focused on reducing trade deficits and increasing American exports, as he strongly believes that the U.S. should be selling more goods to other countries rather than importing more than it exports. However, implementing a 25% tariff could have severe consequences for the American economy as well. The U.S. auto industry, which relies heavily on Canadian-made parts and materials, would experience major supply chain disruptions. Additionally, the U.S. agricultural sector would suffer, as Canada is a key buyer of American farm products. Even the cost of daily consumer goods would rise due to higher import costs. On the other hand, Canada would also face significant economic losses, as its exports to the U.S. would become less competitive. In theory, when a country imposes import taxes, the immediate burden falls on importers, who are forced to pay the tariff costs up front. However, in practice, businesses typically pass these costs on to consumers by increasing prices. As a result, the price of imported goods rises, reducing consumer demand. In response, importers often seek alternative suppliers from other countries where products are cheaper, further reducing demand for Canadian goods in the U.S. If Canadian exports become too expensive, American businesses and consumers may turn to other international suppliers, ultimately hurting Canadian industries. A similar scenario played out in 2018 when the U.S. imposed a 25% tariff on Canadian steel and a 10% tariff on aluminum. One of the immediate effects was a slowdown in GDP growth as manufacturing output declined. Economists estimated that Canada's GDP growth dropped by 0.25% to 0.5% during the period the tariffs were in effect. The tariffs made Canadian steel and aluminum less competitive, reducing demand from U.S. buyers and forcing Canadian manufacturers to scale back production or shut down operations entirely. The impact on employment was also severe, particularly in Ontario and Quebec, where most of Canada's 140,000 steel and aluminum workers were concentrated. Layoffs and production cuts were widespread, and smaller businesses, which relied heavily on exports to the U.S., struggled to stay afloat amid higher costs and shrinking demand. In retaliation, Canada imposed 16.6 billion Canadian dollars, 12.5 billion US dollars, in counter tariffs on U.S. goods, targeting American steel, aluminum, whiskey, orange juice, and dairy products. While this helped mitigate some of the damage, it also led to higher prices for Canadian consumers and businesses. The uncertainty surrounding these trade disputes discouraged new investment, as companies hesitated to expand operations in an unpredictable trade environment. Analysts estimated that the combined economic losses from tariffs and retaliatory measures amounted to billions of dollars in lost trade and GDP output for Canada. The tariffs remained in effect until May 2019, when they were finally lifted following negotiations. However, the economic damage had already been done, with businesses suffering from lost revenue, job losses, and long-term competitiveness challenges. Now, with Trump proposing a new 25% tariff on all Canadian goods except for oil and gas, which would face a 10% tariff, the consequences for Canada's economy could be even worse. If the tariffs are enforced, Canada could experience severe economic contraction, reduced exports, job losses, and a major hit to GDP. The stakes are high, and the outcome of this potential trade war could reshape Canada-U.S. economic relations for years to come. Unlike Canada, Mexico is significantly more dependent on the U.S. market, as nearly 80% of its total exports are shipped to the United States. In 2022, Mexico exported $455 billion worth of goods to the U.S., making it the second largest supplier of foreign goods to the American market, just behind China. The largest categories of exports included automobiles, $29 billion USD, auto parts, $27 billion USD, computers, $32 billion USD, and crude petroleum, $14 billion USD. These industries are deeply integrated into U.S. supply chains, particularly in automotive manufacturing, where factories in Mexico produce parts that are assembled into vehicles in the U.S. In contrast, U.S. exports to Mexico in 2022 were valued at $324 billion US dollars, with key products including refined petroleum, $42 billion US dollars, vehicle parts, $29 billion US dollars, and integrated circuits, $7.9 billion US dollars. Trade between the two countries has long been mutually beneficial, but the trade deficit with Mexico has been a major concern for Trump, who has consistently argued that the U.S. is buying more from Mexico than it sells in return. In 2022, the U.S. trade deficit with Mexico stood at approximately $131 billion US dollars, one of the largest deficits with any country. This imbalance is one of the key reasons Trump has threatened new tariffs, as he aims to pressure Mexico into reducing the deficit by purchasing more American goods. If Trump follows through with a 25% tariff on all Mexican imports, the consequences for Mexico's economy would be devastating. Mexico's GDP is highly dependent on exports, and with the U.S. as its largest trading partner, losing access to the American market at competitive prices would result in massive job losses and economic contraction. Mexican factories that produce automobiles, electronics, and machinery would suffer immediate losses, as U.S. companies might shift production to other countries, such as Vietnam or India, to avoid the tariffs. A major blow would hit Mexico's automotive industry, which is one of the country's biggest economic drivers. Companies such as General Motors, Ford, Toyota, and Volkswagen operate factories in Mexico, using it as a low-cost manufacturing hub for vehicles sold in the U.S. If Mexican-made cars and auto parts suddenly became 25% more expensive, American automakers would face higher costs, which could disrupt supply chains and lead to job cuts in both Mexico and the U.S. Beyond manufacturing, agriculture would also take a hit. Mexico is one of the largest suppliers of fresh produce to the U.S., exporting $2.8 billion worth of avocados, $2.5 billion in tomatoes, and $1 billion in berries annually. A 25% tariff would significantly increase food prices in the U.S., reducing demand for Mexican produce while simultaneously hurting American consumers. Farmers in Mexico, many of whom heavily rely on U.S. buyers, would struggle to find alternative markets, leading to economic distress in rural areas. This is not the first time Trump has used tariffs as leverage against Mexico. In 2018, his administration imposed a 25% tariff on Mexican steel and a 10% tariff on aluminum, citing national security concerns. The impact was immediate and severe, as Mexican steel producers saw a decline in exports, while job losses surged in industrial regions such as Monterrey and Nuevo León, where many metal manufacturers are based. The tariffs also led to a decline in GDP growth for Mexico, as industrial output contracted by nearly 0.3% during the period. Small and medium-sized manufacturers that relied on the U.S. market faced financial difficulties as they were unable to compete with American and Asian suppliers that were not subject to tariffs. In retaliation, Mexico imposed tariffs on U.S. agricultural goods, including pork, apples, and dairy products, which caused financial strain on American farmers. However, the economic damage to Mexico was far greater than the impact on the U.S., forcing Mexico to seek a diplomatic resolution. The tariffs were eventually lifted in May 2019, but the episode highlighted the economic vulnerability of Mexico's dependence on the U.S. market. Now, with Trump threatening to impose a 25% tariff on all Mexican exports, the economic risks for Mexico could be even greater than in 2018. If the tariffs are enacted, Mexico could face a significant economic slowdown, potentially pushing the country into a recession. The Mexican peso would likely depreciate sharply, leading to higher inflation and reduced purchasing power for Mexican consumers. The Mexican government is under immense pressure to prevent these tariffs from taking effect. In the 30-day negotiation period, Mexico has agreed to deploy additional troops to the northern border to curb migration, one of Trump's primary demands. Additionally, the U.S. has pledged to limit gun trafficking into Mexico, which has been a major contributor to cartel violence. However, Trump has only agreed to pause the tariffs temporarily, meaning that if Mexico fails to meet his expectations, the tariffs will still be enforced. What's your thought?